Hi, everyone, and welcome to Davos Dispatch. I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of Devex. We just wrapped up a whirlwind week in Davos, and as always, it was exhilarating and frankly exhausting. But we're here today to give you a post-mortem on what went down. The good, the bad, the hopeful, even the meaningless. Before we get into that, I want to give a little background on what the conference actually is. Most of the time, Davos is a picturesque resort town. It's beloved by skiers and spa enthusiasts. But once a year, it fills to the brim with high-level delegates coming there for the World Economic Forum's annual meeting. And they're there to really work through some of the stickiest problems confronting the world. The official Davos agenda this year had a lot in it about resilience, sustainability, and globalization. And so from our perspective at Devex, it connects a lot to the kinds of stories we're always covering. We even published a survey of humanitarian experts just before the conference, and it found that almost half of humanitarians think the sector needs to undergo wholesale change. That was something that came up a lot during our conversations in Davos. We published a piece as well on the role that tourism plays with humanitarian response. And it was like a tangible example of how the private sector partnerships often talked about at forums like this can work out in the real world. And I also moderated a session with the Wellcome Trust and the Rockefeller Foundation on how climate and health are converging and some opportunities to use digital innovation around that. And it really connected a lot to a piece that we also published in advance of Davos about climate and health and how really that space is changing quickly. I should also mention Devex was actually a media partner of the World Economic Forum, and we co-hosted lots of our own events, including with partners like with Circle, with Microsoft, Verizon, and with the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. You know, a lot of the value that you get from going to Davos is not just the official sessions, it's what happens in between, the networking, the side conversations. It's the kind of place where you can casually chat with Tony Blair at a party, and then you can see Will.i.am showing you his new AI app at an after party. It's that sort of place. And that's partly why it catches a lot of flack for symbolizing everything that's wrong with the world, the inequality, people coming together in the Swiss Alps saying they're going to solve the world's problems at this fabulously expensive venue. But nonetheless, lots of things come out of these meetings. Samantha Power announced the EDGE Fund in a session I moderated. It's a new USAID initiative to promote public-private partnerships. There's big philanthropic organizations who join with business and the public sector to launch a $3 trillion climate action initiative they're calling Giving to Amplify Earth Action. I'm told there's also some progress in a session I moderated called The Power of 100, where social entrepreneurs got connected with some global corporations that could help scale their impact. So, as a news organization, there's hardly a more newsworthy place we could be. So what really happened in Davos? Well, I joined Vince Chadwick, who's our Brussels correspondent, and last week became our Davos correspondent on a Twitter Spaces to try to break it all down now that we've both gotten some very badly needed sleep.
Raj, how are you feeling? Because last time I saw you, you'd lost your voice.
I had, and I think I barely have it back. Davos is an intense week, as you learned, Vince. I think I spoke nonstop for 4 or 5 days and ended up losing my voice as a result. But boy, for us as journalists, it's a target-rich environment. I mean, there are just so many of the people we're covering are there. So many of the issues we're interested in global development are on the agenda. And so it's a lot. It's a lot to take in. What did you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting moment for a journalist because in Brussels, I barely get to speak to any top officials. You have to speak to a spokesperson, you have to wait for weeks, months to get accepted to speak to someone, or people run into meetings and you can't catch people. And then suddenly in the conference center at Davos, or even walking down the street, I mean, I ran into half the cabinet of my native Australia, and in the Congress Centre itself, you'd regularly see heads of state. That's where I ran into Seth Berkley of Gavi. The editor-in-chief of The Economist was kind of sitting there holding court with everyone. I remember once there was a columnist from the Financial Times writing on legal notepaper in one corner his column for the next day, and across the way was a famous battery magnate from the US worth billions of dollars who was reading the Financial Times very theatrically. So you're kind of in the midst of it all. And I think the challenge for us, and what's probably interesting for our audience today is, hey, where does the development community fit into this? Because people have read about Davos, people know about Davos, and the critiques that are often thrown at it. And I think it's a really interesting challenge for the development community because it's such a rare opportunity to mingle with people in the private sector, particularly, that you don't always get to speak to. I know in Brussels, I went to an event a few months ago about engaging the private sector, and there were maybe 100 people in the room and one person from the private sector. And in Davos, it's almost the opposite. There's 100 people from the private sector and one person from global development or Oxfam or whatever it is. So it's not just a target-rich environment for us as journalists. It's a target-rich environment for often cash-strapped development people who are looking, for supporters for their issue. And I spoke to the European Commission's humanitarian aid chief, Janez Lenacic, and in Brussels at the moment, there's not much money for humanitarian aid because so much of the external budget's going to Ukraine. So he's really on the hunt for emerging donors and for innovative models of financing for humanitarian aid. So he came and he was, I think it was his first time. He said, who should I meet? What should I do? He was in learning mode as well. And certainly when I spoke to him, one of the most impressive things was he said, I'm here to learn. And that wasn't the case for everyone. Some people are there to tell a story and some people are there to learn. And certainly he was there to try and see what he could gather. So I'll have a story out on that in a few days based on what he picked up from that.
Hi, I'm Kate Warren, Executive Editor at Devex. If you are listening to this podcast, you are likely working to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But are you subscribed to Devex Newswire? Global development can be a fast-moving, complex sector. Our team of global reporters work every day to bring you the news you need to make sense of it all. In Devex Newswire, we keep you up to date on issues ranging from climate change financing to gender equality and global health to transforming the food system, all in a fun-to-read, free newsletter delivered directly to you 5 days a week. Join the hundreds of thousands of global development professionals who receive Devex Newswire and visit devex.com/newsletters to sign up to this free newsletter today.
I thought I'd start, Raj. I wanted to ask you how you saw the development community connecting with the private sector actors that Davos is famous for. I saw both sides. I saw conversations around localization and things happening in some of the igloos in the ice village that, frankly, I probably would have seen in Brussels in terms of the people who were there. But then I saw really interesting conversations. Often, I remember thinking of one example on turbocharging development finance, where someone from Rabobank in the Netherlands piped up and said, "I can't do blended finance with the EU. I don't know how to do it. It's not working, and that was kind of the magic moment where you've got private and public sector kind of talking together. So my question to you is, to what extent did you see two worlds and where did you see them overlapping in productive ways?
Yeah, I think I've been going there 10 years now, and the worlds continue to get closer and closer together. The development issues themselves, more and more agencies say, hey, we need to get private money in, as you talked about. So that's one reason. And the other reason is that a lot of the big corporations, and that's kind of what Davos is known for, is these really massive global corporates, they increasingly are mainstreaming their business toward development issues. Now, some of them are highly controversial and in the fossil fuel space, et cetera. But more and more, you see the SDG pin on the lapel of the CEO of a company, right? And they know what these SDGs are, and they have a talking point ready about how their business is starting to address these points. And so I think that's another key component of what shifts at Davos is this idea that executives know, well, I'm going to be asked about on stage, maybe by a Devex reporter, I'm going to be asked about what we're doing on the SDGs, and we need to be able to talk about this. And so some of it can easily lend itself to sort of greenwashing, but a lot of it is businesses starting to ask themselves these harder questions about what are we actually doing in low and middle income countries? How are we engaging in blended finance? So you see more and more of that. So I would say overall for our sector, for the global development community, we are now a fundamental part of what happens every year at the World Economic Forum annual meeting. It's not a sideshow. The humanitarian agenda, that's kind of the in quotes, is described as a component of what happens there. And when I, was part of the forum years ago, there would be one session here or one session there. Now there's like a fully robust set of panels and conversations. A bunch of them, Devex co-hosts with the WEF. So it's really more of a mainstream part of the conversation. So I think that's one big thing for people listening and to just know, those who don't go to Davos and don't have a sense of what's happening there, that, big international NGOs, some activists, leaders in our space, they're on stage, they're in the conversations, they're in the rooms. This is a big shift, I think, over the years. And maybe just one other thing on this is, as there's more discussion about how to connect private sector with the very issues that are identified in the SDGs, you're starting to see more happen in the deal-making space at Davos. So Davos is really famous for having the official agenda and then having these chalets up in the hills where people gather in these private, off-the-record meetings where they're doing deals, investment bankers galore at the World Economic Forum annual meeting. Well, a lot of those deal-making sessions, a lot of those private meetings now include big philanthropies who are there trying to do these sorts of deals, trying to shape the global health space. Or they include some of the UN leaders or people like Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's the World Trade Organization's leader and well-known in the development space, working on how to connect trade with the SDGs. So more and more you're seeing that. And I think that's certainly the case this year. And we can get a little bit more maybe into what some of the key takeaways are. But I just want people to be aware that happens at Davos every year.
The other thing I saw that could be interesting to our listeners was I saw the global development community really aligning on a sequence about what they expect to happen this year. And I think as we, there's a certain rhythm to the year in development, often around the spring meetings, annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. The other thing that I heard a lot was people are really looking forward to Emmanuel Macron's summit in June about financing for the Global South. And I think he's planning a focus on special drawing rights. And people are starting to peg that summit really as a pivotal moment in the year to drive momentum. I mean, towards the end of last year, we saw tension around the leadership of the World Bank. Was David Malpass going to survive? I think if you'd asked anyone at Davos about that, everyone now diverts that question to the roadmap for reform, which my colleague Shabtai has been covering really closely. And in the conversations I was in development finance, when it came, a lot of people said, well, it's all about the MDBs now. This is the MDBs year. This is the year we're going to get it done. I think Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, said just after Davos that it's a moment to look at other MDBs, not just the World Bank, but certainly there was a huge focus on the World Bank, and there was a big emphasis on that Emmanuel Macron summit in June as a kind of momentum multiplier towards the World Bank having some really rigorous discussions and concrete proposals ready at the annual meetings at the end of the year. And so I think that was something that I hadn't appreciated quite going in, how much everyone's kind of trying to get in line and push in the same direction when it comes to development finance this year, and what a key role the French could play in that.
Yeah, I wrote a little bit about this in my look ahead piece for 2023. And yeah, my feeling going into Davos was really confirmed by the conversations I had there, which is that all roads lead to the MDBs, that this is where everyone is focused. And the reason is probably the economic backdrop that, most of what people at Davos are talking about, because it's a very European and US focused meeting. And so a lot of the attention is on inflation. It's on, what the WEF calls the cost of living crisis. It's on interest rates and what the Fed and the ECB are doing. So it's on kind of advanced economy problems, right? And when you consider what those problems mean for global development, the trickle-down effect is that the richest countries in the world, the donors, are going to have tighter budgets. They're going to have less money for development assistance. And as the climate keeps getting worse, as conflicts are getting worse, more and more development assistance budgets are being directed to humanitarian assistance. So I talked to a number of UN agency heads who say, yeah, this is a real challenge for us. We're seeing more and more of our focus on humanitarian. Their overall budgets are growing, but more and more of it's going to humanitarian. They have less and less funding that they can use for long-term development issues. So in that context, everybody starts looking at the MDBs because they say, well, that's the place we can go. That maybe without even increasing our paid-in capital, without even adding any additional funds, maybe there's innovative ways to unlock more money out of the MDBs. So we're going to have this 1-2 punch coming up. The first punch is the April spring meetings, the World Bank and the IMF here in Washington, D.C. And then the second one is this Macron summit in June. And I think it was brilliantly designed, by Macron and Mia Mottley and the whole group that wants to reform the international financial structure to happen so soon after the spring meetings. Because I think if the spring meetings don't feel conclusive enough, if there isn't a sense that this roadmap is leading to really significant reform, I think the June summit of big donors will be a chance to send a clearer message. And then, as you say, up in October, when there's the annual meetings of the World Bank, there'll be a chance to say, okay, these big reforms have to happen. They have to happen now. They have to be deeper and more significant than maybe the banks themselves would want to see. So I think we're setting up for a really consequential year for the MDBs as a whole, and certainly for the leading MDB, the World Bank.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say. I heard from some in the space that, if we're not talking about a capital increase, then we start to talk about balance sheet optimization and things like that. I was hearing, look, bankers will say we're pretty optimized already. Thank you very much. And so I wonder, given the focus on this, if we'll be able to avoid a capital increase, as you mentioned. I think that's going to be a really interesting one to watch.
I agree, and I've heard people on both sides of that. I've heard some people coming from the MDBs who told me, this is kind of a pipe dream. You're not going to be able to get more out of these banks without increasing capital. And then there are others, including people who spent a long time working at the MDBs, who say, no, that's not true. There's a lot more we can squeeze out of the current balance sheets of these banks. So it's an interesting dynamic.
Are you interested in the intersection of business and social impact? Do you want to know how corporate sustainability, ESG, impact investing, and more can contribute to development finance? My name is Advas Aldinger. I'm a senior reporter at Devex, and I've been reporting on these issues for nearly a decade. I'm the author of Devex Invested, our free weekly newsletter dedicated to development finance. Every Tuesday, we explore how companies, investors, and market mechanisms are reshaping the world of development finance. Visit devex.com/newsletters and join us on Tuesdays.
Raj, one thing I was disappointed in, and I'm not sure if you got this, was I heard a lot of stuff about de-risking. Like if only, we need people to take more risk, and we need to use aid budgets to de-risk investors and stuff. I mean, that for me feels a little bit already old-fashioned and perhaps not. We've been saying that. I had the impression I've been hearing that for years, and I think that conversation could afford to be nuanced or moved on somehow. I'm not sure how you heard that, but it seems to be the go-to thing people say, but I didn't detect much nuance about how to do that or even any assessment about how it's going so far. Did you hear much on that?
I did hear a lot on it, and I agree with you. It's an old conversation, but the reason they keep talking about it is because not much has been done on it. And I think it connects right back to the MDB reform. The idea is, can the multilateral development banks move from their traditional approach, which is providing large loans to governments to build roads, to build bridges, to do major reforms? Can they move from that model to a model where instead they incentivize private money to go in and fund those roads, those bridges, those ports, those new healthcare systems? And part of that incentivizing, and this is basically blended finance, is de-risking, is saying, hey, we know you private pension fund, you're scared to go invest in this low-income country. You're worried about political risk. You're worried there'll be a government change. You won't get your money back. So we'll take some of that risk. We'll guarantee it. And we'll provide a first loss guarantee. And we'll provide some lower cost of capital to the government, which allows you to charge them a little bit higher cost. You can get a little more interest on the loan that you're going to make. So all of these things are what people want to see the MDBs go and do more of. And so you're right, de-risking is an old discussion, and maybe it's frustrating to keep hearing about it. But I think part of the reason we keep hearing about it is because not that much has really changed in that space. It's relatively static, and that's why this year is going to be so consequential for it.
What did you hear and see that was new to you? What was something that you came away that you weren't even going in thinking you needed to be thinking about and that you took away from the WEF?
Well, I guess I'll say one positive, one negative. So on the negative side, I thought I would hear more about pandemic preparedness. I thought I would hear more about shifts in the global health infrastructure, and I didn't hear that much about it, honestly. I felt like many prior World Economic Forum annual meetings have had really big announcements, like the creation of Gavi or the creation of CEPI, and I just felt like there wasn't as much coming out this year from global health, which is a little bit surprising, given this is the first forum, that's sort of post-pandemic. I mean, there was one back in May that was delayed to the spring because of the pandemic, but I just thought there would be more in that area. The positive one is a session that we actually co-hosted with the WEF on indigenous people and international trade. And it's an example of where Davos could do something powerful that not every summit can do, to take an issue like that, which I really wasn't familiar with. And we worked with the WEF on it, and we were asked to be a part of it, and basically, put this session together of trade ministers and indigenous leaders, and talked about a burgeoning area, which is, there's 500 million indigenous people in the world, and indigenous economies and businesses are really connected to the future of sustainability. And there's a lot of products, like a product like Manuka honey, as an example, a lot of sustainable products, organic products that come out of indigenous peoples. And that there's now a new movement to say, well, hey, when big countries are negotiating trade deals, are we asking our indigenous people about their role in this? Can we protect their intellectual property rights for their products? Can we make sure they're benefiting when their products are being sold globally? And so I thought that was a really fascinating theme, and one that's really relevant to our global development audience, and that was on the agenda at Davos this year.
It's funny you mentioned global health, because I ran into, I was going through security. It's funny the people you meet at security at Davos, but I was going through security, and I thought the guy in front of me was another journalist from Brussels, Bruno Waterfield. And I said, "Oh, Bruno." And he turned around and he said, "I'm not Bruno, I'm Adam." And it was Adam Tooze, the author of the polycrisis. He's not a man who, he didn't invent the term polycrisis, but he's certainly one who took it global. And he said, "Oh, I need a coffee." And I said, "Well, I know just the place." So I took him to the UAE pavilion on the promenade, which had absolutely amazing coffee from a place called the Espresso Lab. If anyone wants to look it up, I'm a bit of a coffee nut, being from Melbourne, Australia. And I went there every day for my coffee, and he's a lovely guy making the best coffee in Davos. Anyway, so I took Adam Tooze for a coffee, and then I said, let's have a quick chat about how everyone's doing and dealing with the polycrisis. And we had a quick chat, which I posted on Twitter. And, it was really striking what he said. He said, "Hey, China, what's happening in China at the moment is arguably the most people ever getting infected at quickest time ever with COVID. And hardly anyone's talking about this at the place that's supposed to be committed to, the greater good, Davos." And so I really join what you say around that. Was I felt like a bit of a blind spot this year. Obviously, there's issues around transparency about understanding what's going on in China, but I lived in the pandemic in Brussels, where there was a big focus on building back better. And I'm feeling now just to focus on building back, and a certain short memory and amnesia about what we've all just lived through. So it's interesting what you say about that. For me, I would nominate a session I went to on logistics with UNICEF. It was really interesting. And this was down in the Ice Village, where they were speaking with a real hard-nosed logistics giants, like I think DP World was on the panel. These are huge logistics companies, and it was moderated by Richard Quest from CNN, who's like the consummate Davos moderator, but he's also very quick to interrupt people, and that was great too, because in Brussels sometimes things can be a little bit sleepy. And what's great with Davos is you've got TV presenters plus private sector people, and you can just have some very fiery, quick, sharp exchanges, because these are people that are used to having those kind of meetings, I guess. And it was quite refreshing to see that brought to bear on logistics. And DP and UNICEF have teamed up a little bit about COVID and getting some of the things UNICEF needed to ship, prioritize. And there was a question that put to the head of logistics, I think, from DP World. They said, "Okay, well, if you've got 3 ships out there and one of them has humanitarian supplies, which one's getting in first?" And he basically said, "Well, we can't give them priority ahead of our other customers." And that was a really interesting debate, and it's probably not for nothing that the session happened and UNICEF, put it on the agenda. But that's something that I must admit, less aware of, but is actually must be a huge issue in the practical side of humanitarian aid. Sure enough, as is often the case with the WEF, you look back and they've done some work on it. They've done a charter on this. Some companies have signed up, some haven't. It was quite interesting to me actually how the WEF has often got great bodies of work and people have been thinking about these things for years. And so, I go back to the example of Commissioner Lunacic on the private sector and humanitarian aid. The WEF's also got a big document looking at all of the innovative financing models for humanitarian aid. So those were really fortuitous experiences for me, which will inform my coverage going forward. Another theme that I detected towards the end of the week was on climate was obviously omnipresent, but there was also a kind of an awareness, I think, that the global north needs to be careful about perceptions of green protectionism. And this came across in two ways. In a session on development finance, it came across with a discussion about natural gas and the role of development banks in investing in natural gas, which has obviously that focus has been sharpened by the war in Ukraine. And certainly in Brussels, I'm hearing people saying, okay, well, EIB says they're not going to invest in natural gas. Well, times change, and guess what? You're going to have to, because, this is an imperfect world and we need to support these countries. And also with EBRD, which is having a energy review this year of its energy policy. So that's one to really watch. And the other one is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, where the EU is saying we're going to impose a tariff on high carbon goods coming into the EU. And it was quite interesting to hear Ngozi, but also Michael Froman, the former US trade representative, saying, careful on this and the message that it sends to the rest of the world. Europe wanting to be, pursue the European Green Deal. It doesn't land very well in the rest of the world when you say you're not going to invest in natural gas, but also you're going to impose tariffs on high carbon goods when countries perhaps don't have any alternative. So that was something that also will inform my conversations next week. The European Investment Bank's having its annual results meeting, and I think that was an interesting thread and a bit of self-awareness, I guess, coming up from the Davos participants, that they needed to be mindful of how their green messaging was landing in the rest of the world.
Yeah, we hosted a couple of private sessions during the week. We had one with some humanitarian leaders at dinner, and just informal dinner. We had an African leader there who made a very similar point and said, look, we're investing in natural gas projects and projects that include some renewable components, but also some fossil fuels. And the rest of these people here at Davos, they just don't get it. And then we had another session, kind of a humanitarian happy hour that we throw every year. We get together a lot of the humanitarian development leaders who are at Davos for just an informal drink. And another African leader at that session was talking to me and said something really similar. And it just feels like, the conversation at the WEF often misses the point of the realities they're dealing with, and says, no, we're going to keep investing in fossil fuels in a lot of our countries. We have no choice. This is going to be a long transition for us. We have energy poverty. So it's really interesting to hear the dichotomous views on this point. And you're right, climate is kind of maybe the underlying theme across everything you talk about there. There were even people at the forum talking to me saying, like a week before we all landed there in Davos, that, hey, the Alps, where Davos is situated, they're green. There's no snow. Fortunately, by the time we arrived, the snow had started falling. But it was kind of a stark visual reminder for people that, hey, the climate really is shifting rapidly. And this underlies every other topic we might want to talk about, is just how quickly the world is shifting. One other thing just worth raising is, you talked a little bit about humanitarian and logistics. We did a survey at Devex in advance of Davos to really ask our audience, especially our audience of humanitarian experts, what do they think about the current state of affairs in the humanitarian space? And we had this kind of shocking result, which is 48% of the people we interviewed about 500 people, 48% said they think the humanitarian sector needs a fundamental transformation. Not like just some reforms and some improvements, but a fundamental shift in the way it's structured and the way it works. And I raised that with many humanitarian leaders in Davos and tried to get their take on it. And I would say generally, even the people who are in the space, like even people working at some of the UN agencies, feel similarly. Some, I talked to one UN agency head who didn't agree with that and thought, no, we're on the right track and we need to just make some more modest reforms. But But there's a growing, palpable sense that the humanitarian sector itself is kind of stretched to its limits, and that something has to give. And we need a really different conversation about what the humanitarian space ought to look like in the future. And there was one session I was in and actually saw Michael Fay, one of the founders of Give Directly, the executive chairman there, and he and I ended up bumping to each other multiple times during the week. And he was there talking about this $1 billion that Give Directly has now provided, straight to people living in extreme poverty, and using that as just an example of, we really ought to shake things up when we can do this, when we can directly fund people. We ought to be thinking about that as a really competitive alternative to some of these more bureaucratic institutions that have very high overheads and that have a lot of complexity. Instead of just ramping up the traditional space, let's look at some of these more disruptive alternatives. So that was another theme that I kept hearing a lot during the week.
It's interesting. So, Raj, I wanted to end by asking you about how you see the humanitarian and development community's engagement with Davos. I mean, I heard from a lot of people, okay, Macron can't come because he's having a pension debate and it's a bad look to be at Davos, or Rishi Sunak is, known as, being a famously wealthy. He can't come because it's not a good look at the moment, with the problems with the NHS. And even among the Oxfams who were there, there was, it's a decision every year to whether to be there or not. I mean, I'm curious, as someone who's in the humanitarian space you are, who knows the WEF and for 10 years, how do you see this dynamic evolving? Are we just stuck in a dynamic where every year we're going to have these debates about whether humanitarians should be there or not? Or is there a way where we can arrive at a more productive dynamic between the forces of enterprise and the kind of humanitarian development people that we're more familiar with in our daily work?
I think it is becoming more productive year after year. I think there's more acknowledgement and awareness that, look, the world is deeply unequal. There are, more than 2,000 billionaires. They do fly around in private jets. And many of them descend on Davos in those private jets. And it's just like crazy to imagine we're talking about global poverty and hunger, and all of this is happening at the same time in this sort of elite gathering. I think you can hold that idea and at the same time say, boy, we ought to use this opportunity. We ought to use it for good. And I think people have come more and more around that. So in the decade I've been going there, I see more philanthropic leaders, more humanitarian leaders, more development leaders. And, they're there and they sort of hold their nose a little bit at some of the things they don't like or agree with, or just the realities of the world that are very apparent in a place like the World Economic Forum's annual meeting. But they see all the productive things you can do with it. Yeah. So I think the caveats all have to be given. Like, we give the caveats all the time when people say, why do you go there? And certainly when I talk to humanitarian NGO leaders, they often give me those caveats, in the advance of an interview or something. But we need to remember the caveats. We need to remember how crazy the situation is. But there is something about the gathering of that much global power, that many decision makers, that creates a real opportunity. And if you can get something on the agenda there, if you can push people to pay attention to an issue there, it can have really positive consequences. So it's no panacea. And I completely respect those of my colleagues. I have a whole bunch of friends in the development space who tell me, like, no, I'd never go there. Going to the WEF annual meeting would be my worst nightmare. I've heard people tell me. I completely respect that opinion. I get it. I don't begrudge them one bit, but I see too why more and more people from our space are attending and are a part of it.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, the one thing I heard from people in our sector was, you just can't imagine how productive I've been. I had people tell me they had 14 meetings in a day. Had people tell me, that they got 3 months worth of work done in 1 week. And then I had exactly people biting their tongue saying, okay, there's some of the extremes here that perhaps we could do without. And it was a bit bewildering even to them. But it was certainly a chance to influence some pretty powerful people. And you can see why that's very interesting. And in the case of Oxfam, the Spanish Prime Minister did mention their report in his speech. And use it as a real linchpin of his speech and stuff. So they certainly viewed that as a win for their work on inequality, which they do each year. Okay, well, Raj, thanks. It's funny. This is probably the most time you and I have spent discussing Davos, even though we spent a week together there, because it was so intense. We barely saw each other in the week there. But I'm glad you're healthy again, and it was really interesting to catch up on some of your insights.
This was great, Vince. Thanks. Hey, you got to experience it for the first time. How insane that week is! It's no sleep. It's hundreds of meetings. It's session after session, but I think we got a lot out of it, and I'm really proud of some of the reporting we did, and I hope it was useful to our audience around the world.
Exactly.
Well, thanks for tuning in, everyone. If you don't already, follow Vince on Twitter at VChadW, and you can follow me at Raj_Devex. I'm sure you're subscribed to our newsletters, but if you want to see where they are, and maybe you're not, check out the description of the podcast. We've got them all linked there. Thanks again for joining us. This has been Davos Dispatch.